From the start, my crew knew something was wrong. When we met in the parking lot, they were all tired smiles and hungry jokes. But the moment our contact showed up, they knew something was wrong. He wore a faded leather jacket, had thinning grey hair and a scar across his face which turned his right eye milky. As he got out to unlock the trailer, he lit up a hand-rolled cigarette. The morning air was so frigid that each puff he took made him look like a dragon. It's when this unkind, draconic man ordered us to get in the back of the truck that my guys started to protest. No one in the crew was new. All of us had worked plenty of shady construction jobs before. Sometimes we'd get blindfolded, sometimes we'd be taken for windowless rides in the backs of trucks. The less we knew, the better for all involved. No one in the crew was new, and they've all worked shady construction jobs before, yet there were still voices of protest. I calmed the men. I told them that come evening we would all be safe and have money in our pockets. They didn't want to load in the back of the truck, but I convinced them things would be okay. As we sat through our bumpy windowless ride, one of the guys pulled out a flask. Working with hammers under the influence isn't the most stellar of ideas, but the air in the truck was tense and the morning was cold. I took a drink myself. I drank with the men and assured them that everything would be okay. We had, after all, done plenty of jobs for the mob before and lived to spend the money. I promised the guys that this project would be no different. When we got out of the truck, however, even my outlook soured. Two men in riot gear and rifles greeted us when we exited the trailer. We could not see their faces and they did not speak. Only our milky-eyed driver had words for us. We were to follow the armed men through the forest until we reached our worksite. When some of my guys expressed displeasure at our armed escort, the driver simply took a long puff of his cigarette and shrugged. "If we weren't up for the job," he said, "we shouldn't have gotten in the truck." Even though I was far from comfortable with the rifles, I, once again, calmed the air. I assured my guys that we were simply hired to replace some stairs and that the men with guns were just a feature of a client intent on secrecy. None of us were going to blab about the work, so none of us had anything to worry about. I had hoped that the guards would help me assure the crew, yet throughout my entire explanation, they stayed silent. The silence of the armed men didn't give me any confidence about our safety, but my words had managed to calm the crew. Without much protest, we followed the armed men through the forest. It wasn't until we had walked for about half an hour that more complaints emerged. Gabbett, one of the schooled welders who had been part of the crew for well over half a decade, started to mumble about old wives' tales. He would point at the trees and shrubs in the forest and insist that they were growing sickly. He kept on saying that we were being taken somewhere cursed, somewhere evil. He kept on saying that we were being taken to... It had been many years since I'd heard the name of that place. As a child, my father would often threaten me with the... if I didn't do my chores or if I misbehaved. The details of what exactly happened to naughty boys at the... were always vague, but the implication was far from pleasant. I was scared of the threat as a child, but long before I became a man, I decided that the place was about as real as Father Winter or legal get-rich-quick schemes. When Gabbett first started talking about the... I pretended I didn't hear him. I saw no change in the trees or shrubbery, and the air was tense enough already because of our armed escort. I figured he would eventually tire of the folklore and leave it be. As we walked, however, Gabbett's words and voice attained greater urgency. I could sense that he was making the other guys nervous, and I feared those nerves might extend to the men with guns. I told Gabbett to cut it out. He didn't. Instead, he started to scream. He started to scream about how we were being taken to the and how we would all perish there in unspeakable ways. I had known Gabbett for a long time, and have always found him to be a measured man, yet in that moment he seemed wholly insane. I grabbed him and shook him and demanded that he return to reason. The show of force had seemingly calmed Gabbett. In mere moments his face transformed of that of utter horror to a blank slate. It wasn't until I had the man by the shoulders that I noticed he was crying. With a deep unease in his voice, he apologised. With tears still pooling around his eyes, he promised he would stop shouting. Were we on any other job, I would have insisted Gabbett immediately go home, yet there was no negotiation with our escort. Gabbett's state made me nervous, but my words had at least quietened him. Foolishly, I hoped that Gabbett would continue to walk down the forest path and calm as he did so. He didn't. Instead, he dropped to his knees and started to dig around the earth. Before I could fully comprehend what he was trying to do, Gabbett jumped on one of the guards. He had a fist-sized stone in his hand. With 3 savage hits, he managed to crack the visor of the guard. 3 hits, however, was all that Gabbett managed to land. The man wearing body armour scarcely needed help to pacify the panicked construction worker. By the time the beating was done, Gabbett was covered in blood and scarcely moving. The guards didn't say a word. They just lifted the bloody man up, jabbed him in the back with the tip of their rifles, and motioned for the crew to continue walking. I tried to calm the guys again, but then there was nothing I could say. They continued to walk, but they did so solely under the order of the rifles. When Gabbett had first started ranting, I took his words for madness. It wasn't until he went silent that I started to lend credence to his fears. The lush forest around us had gone barren. The grass was yellow and sparse. The trees had shed all their leaves, and the bushes that lined the footpath had transformed into jagged bushels of thorns. Gabbett's crazy rambling had made everyone uncomfortable, yet his silence was even more concerning. As we continued to walk through the sickly forest, I started to wonder whether Gabbett had not been right all along. I started to wonder whether the Gundulik Gundur could be real. The trees around us turned more infirm with each step until finally they gave way to a clearing of grey earth. In the centre of that clearing sat a cement shack, and not far from the shack, as if it were a moat protecting an ancient castle, sat a ditch filled with foul-smelling water. We crossed the flimsy plank that had served as a makeshift bridge and were met on the other side with 2 more guards and a man in a lab coat. The man never introduced himself, but his name tag read Dr. Barat. I'd never met the man prior, but my contact told me that he was the one who had requested the construction crew. The scientist didn't introduce himself and ignored any introductions I tried to make. Instead, he was outraged by the bloodied worker. Dr. Barat didn't address me or Gabbett or anyone else in the crew. His rage was wholly focused on the armed guards that accompanied us. The scientist screamed about discipline and keeping the peace and reason, yet the guards had nothing to say in return. They just stood in silence and watched on like statues of armed titans. When Dr. Barat's rage had died down, I made a second attempt at an introduction. The man still didn't give me his name or indulge in any pleasantries, but this time around he did acknowledge me. As if there were considerably more important things for him to attend to, Dr. Barat waved the construction crew inside of the cement shack and told us to head towards the elevator that would take us down to the construction site. The scientist had seemingly calmed, yet as the crew walked past him, his temper flared up again. He recognised one of my guys, Georgi, the biggest man in the crew, a friend of mine from schoolyard days. The scientist stopped the man, mumbled something to the guards, then insisted that the rest of the crew go inside of the cement shack. I tried to say something. I wanted to put my foot down and say that we would refuse to work unless the crew was kept whole, yet the quartet of rifles kept me silent. Our forest escort stayed behind with Dr. Barat and Georgi, and we were ushered into the cement structure by the two other guards. The inside of the shack was simply a barren hall with a freight elevator at its end. For a couple of tense minutes, we stood in the elevator under the watchful eyes of our twin escort. When Dr. Barat returned, he seemed to be in slightly better spirits, but he was still distracted. I asked him what happened to Georgi. As the freight elevator started to grind its way underground, the scientist calmly apologized. Apparently, Georgi had been part of a study the United People's Institute of Science had organized a couple of months prior. Due to bureaucratic nuances, my crew member would not be allowed inside of the facility. I had nothing to worry about. Georgi would be accompanied back to the city and then compensated for his time. The scientist's explanation did not satiate me. Yet there was no time for additional questions. The moment Dr. Barat finished speaking, the elevator came to a stop and its doors ground open. A massive underground hall opened up in front of us. It had the making of an ancient church, yet instead of stained glass windows or statues, the walls were covered in hundreds of plain white doors. On one side of the underground cathedral, worn scaffoldings of metal provided stairs to the countless doors that spread to the vaulted ceilings. On the other side, there was no scaffolding or stairs, only a jagged mess of metal and tools. This was to be our construction project, Dr. Barat informed us. Then, he disappeared into one of the many ground level doors. There were half a dozen more guides waiting for us in the hall. Each one wore the same visored helmet, each was a head taller than me, and each carried in their hands an identical rifle. The sight of the grandiose underground structure, of the armed men, of my bloodied colleague, it tore away any delusions about the not being real. I didn't want to run away, that was not my plan. I was fully committed to making sure my guys were going to exit that hellish place safe and sound. When I followed Dr. Barat into the door he entered, I simply wanted assurance that my crew would be safe and compensated for their work. One of the guards aimed his rifle at me as I tried to move past him, but my insistence that I speak to Dr. Barat lowered his muzzle. Behind me, I could hear Gabbett protest. I could hear some of the other guys asking where I'm going, yet I had no time for an explanation. I didn't want the guard having second thoughts. The hall was tight and dark. Even though I couldn't see a meter ahead, I could hear the echoes of Barat's footsteps somewhere in the pitch blackness. I called out to him, asking for details of how my crew would be paid and how we would be transported back to the parking lot where we had started the morning. Even in the pitch darkness, Dr. Barat's irritation was on full display. The little bit of cordiality that the scientist had showed me in the elevator had completely dissipated. Dr. Barat screamed that I was in a restricted area of the facility and that I was to return to my crew at once. We would be paid and escorted once the work was done. Yet, if I was to go against the rules of the United People's Institute of Science, I would end up significantly worse than my bloodied colleague. I did not want to abandon my guys. I wanted to do everything in my power to make sure we would all get out safe and sound. It was, after all, my fault that they had ended up in that horrid place. Dr. Barat's irritated insistence about how nothing bad would happen to us if we followed orders, however, assured me of the exact opposite. I have worked enough shady construction jobs to know when a client wasn't planning on paying us. Perhaps if he had seen me, my words wouldn't convince him. With the hallway being pitch black, however, all that the scientist had to go off was my voice. I apologized for the interruption, assured him that my men would finish off the job we were hired for, and then I started to walk back towards the grand hall. My heart was beating at such a rapid pace that I could barely hear the sound of my footsteps, but Dr. Barat seemed convinced. By the time I reached the door, I could hear the scientist walking away. Before I even had my hand on the door handle, the door on the other side of the hallway had opened and closed. I did not leave the hallway. Instead, I peeked out into the cathedral-like structure to watch my crew. All were busying themselves with the metal that was meant to turn to stairs. All except Gabbett. He stood over the pile of material and tools like a man who had arrived from space. Even from my hiding place, I could hear the bloodied man's mumbles. The rest of the crew pretended not to hear him and busied themselves with the tools, yet the visored guards kept their eyes trained on him. When Gabbett's mumbles rose to shouts, they raised their rifles. It did not take long for Gabbett's madness to peak. With shouts of doom and death, the man ran back towards the freight elevator. He did not get far. A singular shot dropped him to the floor. I shut the door and hid in the darkness. It was my fault he had descended to that horrid place. It was my fault the crew was trapped in that underground cathedral. There was nothing more that I wanted to do but to ensure the safety of my guys, yet seeing Gabbett be shot like a rabid dog sobered me. It was every man for himself. The hallway was impossibly long. As I ran through the abyss, I could hear another shot ring out from the grand hall behind me. Chaos erupted at my back, and screaming and running and more shots, yet the chaos did not last. Soon enough, it was drowned out by much more terrible sounds. The screams did not slow my step, but they chilled my heart. On the other side of the darkness sat something inhuman, a multitude of monstrosities which howled in pain and panic. Whatever awaited me beyond the door which Dr. Barat had walked through was the stuff of nightmares, yet the hall that lay behind me promised certain death. I felt my way for the handle of the door and yanked it open. Dim floor lights illuminated two paths on the other side of the door. To the right, lit up with fluorescent lights on high ceilings, sat some sort of loading dock filled with crates. To the left, illuminated only by the blinking lights of incomprehensible machinery, sat a second room. In the faint blinking lights, I could see movement. Glazed eyes bigger than my head, massive crunching teeth the size of my fists. It was the beings in the darkness that let out those haunting cries. It was the beings in the darkness which I wanted to avoid. I crept my way to the loading dock, scanning the hall for any trace of movement. Most of the crates were nailed shut, but a few had their lids undone and revealed their contents. Clear plastic bottles with the label GH058. Inside the bottles sat a bright pink liquid which seemed to have the consistency of runny porridge. There was something about the contents of the bottles which seemed wholly non-Newtonian, but before I could examine its contents further, a familiar voice pulled me back to reality.
I understand there are many nuances to keeping the security of the Institute, but this is unacceptable. The guards have to be replaced. Their intellectual capacity isn't just an inconvenience, it's a danger to the safety of the Institute.
Dr. Barat. His voice and footsteps echoed from the far end of the loading dock.
These things cost money. I do not need this explained to me. The budget is tight. I get it. What I need you to understand is that we cannot have the security of the Institute rely on the whims of mute imbeciles.
He was getting closer. There was someone with him. A second pair of footsteps, a female voice. Every bit of my being wanted to avoid the dimly lit room from which the screams came, yet there was no place for me to hide within the loading dock. The nightmarish screams from the darkness drowned out all trace of Dr. Barat's voice. In the faint light of the machinery, I could make out a trio of screaming mouths. Neither human nor animal, the creatures loomed above me with their massive eyeballs and screamed.
I can't think with all this screaming.
I heard Dr. Barat yell in the other room. As if in response, a blood-red light started to blink above me. In flashes of crimson, the room was illuminated to reveal the trio of monstrosities connected to the machinery. They looked like massive limbed peaches that had somehow obtained sentience. On each of their malformed bodies sat drooping eyeballs which scanned the room in animalistic panic. The light above blinked faster and faster until finally its shine became constant. The trio of nightmares shook as if they had gotten their massive tongues stuck in an electrical socket. The frenzied movements of their stubby limbs grew wilder by the second. Smoke started to rise from their skin. Their wails reached a horrid pitch, and then with discomforting suddenness, the creatures went limp. The light above went dark. The machinery attached to the creatures started to hum. Streaks of bright pink liquid moved through translucent pipes into the wall. The air smelled of fried meat.
Much better.
Dr. Barat said.
I do not comprehend why our colleagues couldn't just...
It is not your place to judge the methods of our colleagues, Comrade Barrett,
replied a sharp female voice.
It is also not my place to listen to your constant complaints. Suggest a course of action to fix the issues you have caused, or stay silent.
I caused? If memory serves me well, Dr. Alieva, you were there when...
His voice got caught in his throat. The scientist let out a cough as if it were a form of punctuation.
What I suggest is that the profits from this batch of GH-058 bomb be committed to a new round of scans to replace our current lackluster security forces. The United People's Institute of Science cannot be defended by...
The institute you speak of ceased to exist decades ago, Comrade Barrett. You may not enjoy the current circumstances of your employment, but the United People's Institute of Science is no more. Let us call things by their proper name. What you are saying is that you are unhappy with the current security personnel of...
The mere mention of the name forced a wheeze from the nightmare being closest to me. At the force of the sound, the beast's massive mouth forced open and chunks of spittle started to drip onto the floor. One chunk of mucus fell, then another, and only with the third did Dr. Barat speak again.
Yes,
he said, defeat and frustration gripping his voice.
We can say that I am unhappy with the current security personnel.
Your complaint has been noted. In the future, a second round of scans can be conducted. The current state of affairs, however, leads us to more pressing questions for the secrecy and stable conduct of the... Primarily, we should be focusing our resources on...
An opening door cut off the female voice. For a moment, all that could be heard was the soft wheezes of the horrid creature next to me.
See?
Dr. Barat finally broke the silence.
They can't speak. I understand the need for secrecy, but how are we to keep this place safe if we cannot communicate with the guards?
He wants us to follow him.
The woman replied as if she was speaking to an idiot.
Perhaps the laborers you've hired have proved to be uncooperative.
Shit.
Dr. Barat hissed after a moment of consideration. I could hear him open the door and run down the dark hallway towards the cathedral hall. After a brief pause, the door opened again and the calm, controlled steps of the female scientist followed. The nightmares heaving next to me chilled my heart to the very core, but I stayed curled up next to them until I was absolutely certain there was no one else around. The thought of what was happening to my guys bothered me, but by then the sheer need for survival and escape had taken over my mind. I knew that trying to make my exit through the freight elevator would lead to a fate no different than Gabbitt's. What I also knew, however, was that the pink bottles of GH-058 were destined for sale. I was unsure of whether my plan would work, yet no other choices presented themselves. The few crates that were left open were mostly full, but with some quick transfers I managed to empty one enough to make room for my body. The bottles that I shared the space with shone with an irritating pink glow and emitted an unpleasant heat, yet my mind had no capacity for discomfort. All I could do was worry about the loose lid I had placed over my head. All I could do was think about the monstrosities in the adjacent room and the vague stories of terror I had heard about the as a child. I lay curled up inside of the crate for what felt like a lifetime. Sweat rolled down my back, I struggled for breath, and once the hours tallied up, my legs started to cramp. Occasionally, footsteps would cross through the loading dock. Through those few moments, time slowed down to a halt. I was certain I would be found. I was certain I would meet the same fate as Gabbett and the rest of the crew. Yet I didn't. The innards of the crate were beyond uncomfortable, but they kept me safe. I stayed still for long enough for exhaustion to take a grasp of my mind. I thought myself far too terrified to fall asleep, yet the longer I sat in the crate, the less certain I was of being awake. It was during one of my muddy bouts of unconsciousness that I felt the crate being moved. Something heavy, presumably another crate, was placed on top of my lid. I was now fully trapped and breathing became more laborious, but I could tell that my body was in movement. I could tell I was being moved away from the... When the crate finally came to a rest, it took me a long time to move. Partially I was consumed by the utter exhaustion of my ideal. Partially I was scared to find myself in a place even worse than that underground hellscape. Yet the longer I sat in the still crate, the higher the chances were of someone discovering me. There was resistance from the top of the crate, but there was enough adrenaline in my veins to not make it an insurmountable obstacle. I found myself standing in a dark warehouse with a leaking crate of pink at my feet. For a moment I had feared I was still inside of the underground structure, but a window revealing an overcast sky outside calmed my mind. Without much thought, I grabbed one of the bottles of GH058, stuffed it inside of my jacket and made my way out of the warehouse. The warehouse was situated in the long abandoned industrial area of the city. There was no security. Only a man in a beat-up leather jacket smoking by the gate. I was starving and exhausted, and my mouth was as dry as sand, yet I still found the strength to climb over the fence and run to safety. The man in the leather jacket didn't even turn his head when I reached the street. I was beyond ecstatic to have escaped the whole situation alive, yet by the time I reached my home the guilt caught up with me. My crew were good guys. We worked shady jobs for shady people, but they were all good guys. I refused to contact them on the off chance that Dr. Barat or his mute guards might still be searching for me. But I fear I'm the only one who managed to make it out of that horrible place alive. My friends are gone, and I've witnessed hell. All I have to show for it is a pink bottle of GH058.
And so concludes another episode of the United People's Institute series. Next Thursday comes a tale of stepdads, baldness, and hair creams, read by Nora Austin Murphy. If you can't wait a full week for another episode, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger for the full 20-story season and a bunch of other early and bonus content. Also, if you haven't heard the first season of the United People's Institute series, there's a big old jumbo video of it down in the pinned comment for binge consumption. Big thanks to Michael Pettum and Anna Elise for lending their voices to the tale, and Repulsive for providing the spooky tunes. If you made it this far into the video, tell me a tale of drama from your place of work. Who knows, maybe a bit of your spilled tea will soak itself into another tale on the channel. And finally, as usual, a huge thanks to patrons for making the show possible. Big old thanks to Bob Condor, Dante Kincaid, Matt, Joyce, Mr. CreepyPasta, Kus, Christopher Barunda, Dying Sun, Charlie Cooper, Paul Evans, Quiet Pills, Shion, and Larry V. If you want to join these illustrious scientific minds, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger. That's it for me this week. Hope everyone is safe, sane, and healthy out there.